My name is Dr. Alexander Carpenter, and I'm the director of the Worth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies here at the University of Alberta. And I would like to welcome you all to today's Zoom talk, Putin's War in Ukraine, presented by Dr. David Marples. I wish I could say I was happy or delighted to welcome you all, and we have a very large audience today, but the circumstances that have brought us together for today's talk are anything but happy or delightful. What is currently happening in Ukraine is of deep importance to those of us who are scholars of the region in one way or another, but of course is much more pressing and traumatic an issue for our friends and colleagues in the Ukraine and Central Europe, for the members of our local Ukrainian community, for many of our staff, students, and faculty here at the University of Alberta. While the Ukraine does not fall within the ambit of the Worth Institute's Central European countries, the Institute has a long history of collaboration with our colleagues in Ukrainian and Eastern European studies. And as is becoming increasingly more obvious day by day, this conflict is not a civil war or a regional border dispute. It has serious and growing implications for the neighboring countries of Central Europe, including Poland and Hungary and Slovakia, and also for Western Europe. And indeed, it seems for the whole world. So with this in mind, we're very fortunate that Dr. Marples has agreed to give today's talk. I would like to say, given the many books and scholarly articles that he has published on the topic of the Ukraine and Russia and Eastern Europe, that he needs no introduction, which is probably mostly true. But I would nonetheless like to tell you that Dr. Marples is a distinguished university professor of history here at the University of Alberta. He's the author of 16 books on a variety of topics relating to the Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And he is the editor of The War in Ukraine, War in Ukraine's Donbas, Origins, Contexts, and the Future, which was just published a few weeks ago. So I therefore can't imagine a scholar whose insights, analysis, and experience are timelier or more needed than our Dr. Marples at this moment. After the talk, Dr. Marples will participate in a Q&A session moderated by Dr. Laurie Thorkelson, Professor of Political Science here at the University of Alberta. Dr. Thorkelson is also the founding director of the European Union Center of Excellence. So if you have a question for Dr. Marples, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now I will turn the screen over to David Marples. Thank you, David.
Thanks very much, Alex. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen and see if this works out okay. Okay, so I've called this Russia's war on Ukraine. And obviously in 30 minutes, there are limits to what one can cover. And if I don't cover a particular area, you're welcome to ask in the chat. And I cannot claim to be an expert in every area either. But what I'd like to do today is to introduce some thinking about why this happened, the history of Ukraine as an independent state and how relations with Russia developed in that period, and then turn to the recent events, beginning with the Russian demands that were put to NATO and to the Western world, and the more immediate consequences of the war. And a few suggestions on how things might develop in the future. I went back to start with 1997, after 6 years of friendship, 6 years of independence, sorry, the Treaty of Friendship was signed between Russia and Ukraine. And this was a treaty between Boris Yeltsin as president of Russia and Leonid Kuchma, the president of Ukraine. And one of the main results of this treaty was the division of the Black Sea Fleet, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, between the two states, with Russia being given about 83% of that fleet, Ukraine the remaining 17%, and Russia being allowed to lease 2 bays at the port of Sevastopol in the Crimea. And this was a turning point because up to that time, there'd been considerable tension in Crimea and even one attempt to declare independence. Up to this time, relations were reasonably good. In the year 2000, Viktor Yushchenko led a party called Nasha Ukraina, or Our Ukraine, which purported to sort of change the direction of Ukrainian politics between the traditional politics practiced in the late Soviet period and early independence period into something that focused more on the interests of Ukraine and Ukraine's national and cultural development. In 2004, Yushchenko ran for the presidency, and he was opposed by Viktor Yanukovych, who was quite clearly the choice of Russia and Vladimir Putin. In fact, there were elections, campaigning was done for Yanukovych in Moscow as well as in Ukraine. And the results of this were that there was a contested second round of the election when the results from the Donbas region arrived rather late and completely changed the vote in favor of Yanukovych. There were mass protests known today as the Orange Revolution, and the ultimate result was the rerunning of that second round of the election and the victory of Yushchenko in the second round. In 2008, NATO offered a membership action plan to both Ukraine and to Georgia. That was not direct membership, but like a fast track towards NATO membership. And as a result of this, two regions of Georgia broke away with Russian support, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Russian troops arrived in Georgia and went to the capital and went to the city of Gori and other places. Ukraine pulled away from accepting this offer and therefore was okay in 2008. But we know now that there was a plan even in 2008 to occupy Crimea on the table. In 2010, Yushchenko did run for re-election again, but he was by that time not very popular, and the election was won by Viktor Yanukovych, the former governor of Donetsk. And as a result of that, for the next 3 years or so, Ukraine was run as a sort of mafia clan from the Donetsk region. And most of the cabinet, including the prime minister, came from that region as well. It was a time of absolute corruption at the highest levels of Ukrainian leadership. In 2013, the Europeans had been working on a partnership with Ukraine and the other near abroad countries. And as a result of that, Ukraine was offered associate membership in the European Union. And Yanukovych appeared to go along with this. But at the last minute, he received a counter offer from Vladimir Putin, pulled out of it, and there were mass protests that began in November of that year in the central square of Kiev. These got increasingly violent. On December the 1st, the Berkut police cleared the square by force, but that only seemed to increase the numbers. And by February, the situation reached its peak when the protests became violent. About 100 people were killed in the square by snipers, and Viktor Yanukovych fled from his palace outside Kiev and eventually ended up in Russia. And this protest, generally known as the Euro Maidan, later became known as the Revolution of Dignity. Almost immediately afterwards, Russia annexed Crimea and fomented a war in the Donbas that is continuing to the present day. And at two stages of this war, in August 2014 and early February 2015, the Russian army itself intervened directly to turn the tide against the Ukrainian army, which was given the acronym the anti-terrorist operation. And the result was the Minsk Accords. They took place twice, first in September 2014 and then in February 2015. And these accords specified that the sides had to lay down their weapons, withdraw all the major forces, and that in the future, there will be monitoring by an OSCE mission of the demilitarized zone in the center between Russian-supported troops and Ukrainian troops, that Ukraine would give some form of autonomy to the Donbas region, and that the Russian army would allow Ukraine to regain control over its own border. And this is just a scene from the Maidan to remind you what it was like in Kiev 8 years ago, just over 8 years ago, I guess, today, when it reached its peak. Moving forward to Russia's differences with Ukraine that have emerged today. The war in the Donbas has taken on the form of a war of attrition, whereby altogether about 14,000 Ukrainians are dead, an unknown number on the other side, and about 2 million people are officially displaced persons or internal and external refugees from this region. But the war has continued. And one of the promises of Zelensky when he became president in the summer of 2019 is that he would try to end this war. By the way, I'm deliberately missing out the presidency of Petro Poroshenko from 2014 to 2019, but I will mention him in passing. Russia has been disappointed in Zelensky. They felt when Zelensky became the president, he was an unknown figure from Kryvyi Rih. His background was as a comic actor working in the Russian language. He was well known in Russia, and he was expected to change the policies of his predecessors, especially Poroshenko, who had proved to be a very obdurate and difficult president for Russia to deal with. But it didn't happen. Neither Zelensky nor the Ukrainian parliament has yet offered autonomy to the breakaway regions. It's had a difficult passage because it would require changes to the Ukrainian constitution. Poroshenko, before he left office, nationalized the Russian Orthodox Church, most of the dioceses of which were in Ukraine anyway. Zelensky has relied on US support from the very beginning. He got tied up in the Trump impeachment process. He's also arrested pro-Russian leaders and parliamentarians such as Viktor Medvedchuk, and he shut down a number of Russian media outlets in Ukraine and generally tried to curb the Russian media from having a voice in Ukrainian politics because it's regarded by Zelensky as a kind of fifth column from within. Russia's claims against the West, when they were initially put forward earlier this year, were as follows. There was the alleged promise of non-expansion of NATO after 1990, something supposedly promised by James Baker, who was Secretary of State at the time when his dealings with Gorbachev, and the two were discussing the unification of Germany and what that would entail. Gorbachev has since said that there was never anything in writing about the non-expansion of NATO. Then the NATO membership action plans that I already mentioned, NATO's military buildup in the Baltic states and Poland, and the fact that Western military trainers have been used in Ukraine and Latvia and other places to train local soldiers. There's also alleged responsibility for the protests that removed Yanukovych. Putin maintains that what happened in 2014 was a coup d'etat that led to neo-Nazis taking over the control of the Ukrainian government. That is something I'm prepared to address later in the question period. There was also resentment by Russia at claims of interference in the US election of 2016, when it was thought that the Russians engineered the victory of Donald J. Trump. Then in 2020, alleged intrusions by the Westerners into the election protests in Belarus, when for the first election in Belarusian history, Lukashenka clearly did not win, and thousands of people massed in the streets of Minsk in the largest protests ever seen in the history of independent Belarus. So we look at the enlargement of NATO between 1949 and the present day. I don't think every state is in there. Northern Macedonia probably has to be added. But the states that are of most concern to Russia, one would imagine, are the Baltic states and perhaps Poland. Poland joined NATO in 1999, and these three Baltic states joined in 2004. So in fact, it's 18 years since any new state on the border of Russia entered NATO. And yet this was the early focus of Russia's complaints to the West about the current situation. So what did Russia demand? It demanded a ban on Ukraine ever entering NATO, that there would be no NATO drills in Ukraine without Russia's permission, that the NATO membership would be removed from the states that bordered Russia, which of course means the 3 Baltic states, the removal of heavy weapons from these same states, and a return to the positions of 1997, which would remove NATO membership from Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania, among others. And lastly, that there should be legal guarantees of Russian security. They were the demands put forward by Putin and by his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. So what can we make of these? Well, first of all, I think they were putting forward demands that were more or less impossible to meet. They could not have expected that there would be positive answers from the United States or NATO on any of these questions. And they've done so in order to meet immediate goals. First of all, to bring the West to the table to negotiate, which to some extent did happen. Expediting a solution to the Donbas crisis, though I remain a little bit ambivalent about how seriously they wanted a solution to the Donbas crisis, given that it was left to fester for so long, and Russia had other concerns around the world, for example, in Syria, and were less concerned about the Donbas, which had declared independence, but not actually been recognized by Russia. There's Putin's desire to resolve the problems of the collapse of the Soviet Union and what he sees as Russia's retreat or pullback in the face of aggressive Western demands. There's also a question of Putin's legacy and political future and his obsession with Ukraine. Putin has brought Ukraine up many times during his presidency. He's been to the archives, he's delved in history, he's come up with documents, all purporting to show that from the 19th century onward, in fact, even earlier, one could say even from 1654 with the Treaty of Pereyaslav, Ukraine has been an integral part of the Russian state. Putin feels that Ukraine and Russia are the same people and that they are united by language, by culture and religion. And this has become something of an obsession. And I also have some concerns about Putin's psychological state. He turned 70 this year. He's been in power with one brief interim when he was prime minister since 1999, in August, when he became prime minister. He seems to be obsessed with his legacy and resolving the problems that he now sees as slowing Russian progress. I put forward this map of the Russian Empire in 1900 because this is something that Putin's referring to over and over again, the time of the Russian Empire. And you can see that most of contemporary Ukraine is included here. The only part of Ukraine that's not included would be Galicia here with Bukovina, city of Lviv or Lemberg as it was called at that time, and Transcarpathia added later in 1945. This is how Putin perceives his world today. So in November of 2021, we saw about 100,000 troops massing on the eastern border of Ukraine. And I think many Russia watchers were somewhat concerned, but not over concerned, because about a year earlier, he'd done the same thing to bring about that many troops to the eastern border of Ukraine. But this time, there was also a massive buildup of weapons, including their most advanced tanks and missiles. There's been a constant barrage on social media in Russia directed against Ukraine, alleging that neo-Nazis are in charge of Ukraine. And this has been quite effective within Russian society. I mean, there's currently about 70% of Russians support Putin today. And this is quite a recent poll. So it's not done any harm to Putin so far, what's happened. You also got the buildup of forces in Belarus, allegedly to take part in a military exercise between February the 20th and 27th, I think it was. But to the west, where it was expected, but also to the south, and about 30 to 35,000 Russian troops taking part in this exercise with Belarusian troops. And many of these troops began to gather just north of Ukraine, just north of Kiev region, in the zone that was contaminated by the Chernobyl disaster. And this was not part of the military exercises. So at that point, I think many people suspected that an invasion was in the offing. There's been the growing control of Russia over Belarus since 2021. It's proved to be the only friend to President so-called Lukashenka. And yet Russia has increasingly controlled Belarusian foreign policy and brought Belarus very much into the Russian orbit. There's also a budding friendship with China, a new phenomenon, and maybe not a long-lasting one, mainly perhaps to intimidate the West and to show that Putin does have backing, perhaps also to ensure that if oil and gas supplies are cut off by the Europeans from Russia, they have a ready market in China prepared to take up the mantle of Russian exports. And then on February the 24th, this massive invasion started from three sides of Ukraine, the east, the north, and the south, targeting Kiev and other major cities of Ukraine, particularly Kharkiv, the second city of Ukraine in the northeast. So we see this is March the 1st, 2022, which is what, yesterday, where Russian troops were. And you can see the main thrust from the south, from Crimea. Kherson was a city that was reported under Russian control until yesterday. Today, there are mixed reports. The Ukrainians claim to have regained it. From the north, from Belarus, the Chernobyl nuclear power station, for example, is in the hands of Russian troops. Kharkiv, you see here, has not been occupied, but it's under attack. And this region to the east, unfortunately, I can't see it when my slide's up, but I can assure you it goes further to the east than this. And it shows these breakaway republics and the port of Mariupol in the south here, and the port of Berdyansk in the eastern part of Zaporizhia region, which apparently has fallen under Russian control. Some comments just to make in general before I sum up what I think possibly could come out of this enormous attack. The Russian economy has been doing relatively well, but it's well known for being unidimensional. That is, it's overemphasizing oil and gas as the main bringer of finances and money to Russia. So when the oil prices fall, the Russian economy is tended to fall below. And we in Alberta are rather familiar with this kind of cycle. But today, the oil and gas prices are high. By gross domestic product compared with other countries in the world, Russia is a medium power. For example, the state of California has a GDP twice the size of Russia. It's more or less equivalent to the size of Italy. This war has also united the democratic world against the invasion to a surprising degree. Even Germany, to which a pipeline, Nord Stream 2, has recently been completed, which would transport oil directly from Russia to Greifswald in eastern Germany, that has been suspended, and Germany has started to send offensive weapons to Ukraine. Countries like Switzerland have also spoken out against the invasion, and Sweden and other countries are now talking about joining NATO. But also within Ukraine itself, there's been unity against the invasion. The popularity of President Zelensky prior to this military campaign was about 28 to 30%. It hadn't gone higher than 30% for some time. Now it's around 90%. The whole country has united around President Zelensky. The sanctions are already causing some problems with Russia after about a week. There's been the risk of expulsion from SWIFT, and in fact, it's happened as far as some banks are concerned, and the reduction of exports. The Russian ruble has plummeted to its lowest level ever recorded. The Russian stock market has been closed for the last 3 days, and there's been a run on several Russian banks which have lost their value on the stock market, such as Sberbank. Putin is demanding a place on the world stage, but unlike earlier times in his presidency, and I just discussed one of them with my class before I came here, he's become ruled by emotion. and by his warped understanding of the historical past. And this is unusual, and it's very worrisome. So what about possible outcomes to try to reach some kind of conclusion? What does Russia want to do with this invasion? We've heard so far that there is a desire to replace the government of Ukraine. And although nothing has been said about two of the figures I put here, Zelensky and Poroshenko, Zelensky has claimed that he is the #1 target. Russia has already stated that it would not allow former acting president Alexander Turchinov, who sent the Ukrainian army east into the occupied Donbas region in 2014. He is a prime target to be arrested and mustn't be allowed to leave Ukraine. There's a possibility that Russia wants to form a new state, a kind of greater Russia or Russia, with Ukraine and Belarus included in it. There's a possibility that the invasion could fail. It's been rather sluggish so far. It's failed on several attempts to capture major cities. But that would mean the removal of Vladimir Putin, who has said his entire presidency now is based on winning this war. The possibility of the decline or collapse of the Russian economy as a result of sanctions, the removal of Vladimir Putin from within, the army, perhaps the secret police, or perhaps the oligarchs who are going to be hit hardest initially, along with the poorest stratum of the Russian population, will be most affected by these sanctions. Putin has also said that if Western states or NATO interferes in this war, he will take measures such as have never been seen before by the world. And most people took that to mean that he would resort to using nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons were also mentioned by the foreign minister in a statement today. But even if Ukraine was occupied by this war, I can see a long-term period of guerrilla warfare by Ukrainians with the support of the West that will take place on a constant basis from the moment that Ukraine becomes occupied and the president is detained or arrested or killed. And lastly, there's also the possibility of a third power mediating through the United Nations, most likely, but not necessarily. And the likely power, it seems to me, that could step forward to do that is China. I cannot think of any other power that would be accepted by Russia as a mediator in this war other than China. And the Western world has many differences with China. China's also got what we see as many problems in the way it's abused democratic rights. But notwithstanding, China is a possible way out of this situation. So with that, I will end my screen share and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, David. Just before the Q&A begins, I should mention, I mentioned at the top of the introductory remarks that Professor Laurie Thorlickson, will be moderating the Q&A. She's Professor of Political Science at the University of Alberta. And among her many Central European-focused scholarly activities, Dr. Thorlickson is involved in research that assesses the impact of the EU on democratic development, particularly in post-communist states. And I should mention too that along with Dr. Marples, Dr. Thorlickson is a member of the Worth Institute's Academic Advisory Board. So thank you, Dr. Thorlickson, for moderating, and I'll throw it over to you and to David.
Thank you very much. And thank you, David, for that talk. Gave us a lot of really important background, and there's so many dimensions to this conflict. I'm going to start with a question that's come in from our audience. We have a lot of questions coming in, and this will just kick us off. And could you please explain, why is it important to call it Ukraine, not the Ukraine? And then connected to that, I'm going to ask you if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on Ukrainian narratives of nationalism and concept of identity, because one of the narratives, as you mentioned, that's coming from Russia is that Ukraine doesn't really exist, that it's really just part of belongs to a greater Russia. So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the term the Ukraine was used at times in the past when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, but the very implication of that is that Ukraine is a borderland, and a borderland of another state, rather than an independent state in its own right. It's not always an offensive term to use and for example, we have the Netherlands, which is not regarded as insulting to Dutch people. But in the Ukrainian case, in terms of developing their own identity, it's essential that you remove the. So it doesn't seem that Ukraine is something transitory or border state of belonging to another kind of universe, that Ukraine is a state in its own right and has been recognized such since 1991. In terms of a longer term identity, the origins of Ukraine have traditionally been seen in 988 when Prince Volodymyr accepted Christianity in Kiev and Rus. And Mikhailo Hrushevsky, the most renowned Ukrainian historian, has traced the thread of Ukrainian statehood and identity from that period through to the present day, even though Ukraine at different times in its history has been a part of different states. There have often been different forms of Ukrainian states, such as the Hetmanate in the 17th century, when an alliance was signed with Russia, the Cossack states of later years, the independent state that was declared in January of 1918 after the Russian Revolution, an abortive state declared in Lviv in June of 1941. And there have been these different attempts at Ukrainian statehood and aspirations, I think, for statehood generally, but it's 1991 that saw the beginning of 30 years of statehood agreed to by Russia and others. In terms of identity, the modern state, I think, has perceived the famine or Holodomor of 1933 as a defining moment in a national identity of Ukraine, and one that clearly separates it from the Soviet state led by Stalin in Moscow, which perpetrated this atrocity in Ukraine. And there are, of course, other ways to define Ukrainian identity, but this accusation that Nazis took over Ukraine, if you look at the Maidan protests, were there far-right forces in the Maidan? There were. There's no question about that, and there's no point in denying it. There certainly were. But in the elections that followed in the spring and summer of 2014, the result was a victory for, let's say, center, mildly right forces, democratic forces, resulting in the presidency of Petro Poroshenko, and the far-right forces got between 1% and 2% of the total vote in Ukraine. In other words, the accusation of neo-Nazis taking control is far-fetched. The current president of Ukraine is a Jewish man from Kryvyi Rih. The previous prime minister before he came to power was Jewish as well. So this is kind of ironic if neo-Nazis have come to power in Ukraine, that you would choose Jewish leaders to run the state. I have not seen of late any changes. The way Ukrainians look at the world is fairly centrist, and the centrist leaders have won every election so far, whether it's been communists or people running on a more national platform. They've been defeated. It's a good question, Laurie.
We have a number of questions that are coming in regarding NATO, and so I'll break this into a couple of parts. And so first of all, can you comment on the possibility of Finland or Sweden possibly joining NATO? We've seen developments recently since the conflict began. Also, what would be the implications of Ukraine joining NATO now? And I'll just throw in with that, if you could elaborate a little bit on how Ukraine's closer cooperation with NATO got started. Was that on the initiative of Ukraine or on NATO?
Well, the attitude towards NATO in Ukraine has changed quite considerably over the years of independence. And if you'd taken a poll even 10 years ago, the result would have been a majority are opposed to joining NATO. This has begun to change, and gradually more and more Ukrainians, especially with a growing threat from Russia, have opted for this idea of wanting to join NATO. I think in 2008, if you'd had a referendum on the subject, it would have been turned down. If you had one, let's say on February the 20th, before this invasion took place, it would have been overwhelmingly in favor, probably around 65, 70% in favor. So I would say that that attitude has changed. NATO, although it's expanded, and maybe more could be said about why it's expanded and whether it should have expanded so far, it's generally expanded because these countries asked to join. That is, Poland and particularly the Baltic states felt that there was a danger of them falling victim to Russian aggression if they were not members of NATO. So this is not so much NATO expanding, but these countries joining in order to protect themselves. And I think that's a reasonable explanation, because I don't think Russia today, but at least up to now, has been under any kind of threat from NATO. Russia is not in danger of being attacked. NATO would never have been so foolish as to attack Russia with its arsenal of nuclear weapons. So that's why I think this NATO thing, while yes, it's important, but it's not the main reason why Russia has attacked Ukraine. I think that's what I would like to stress most. As for Finland, Sweden, other countries, well, the membership would depend on many things, but Finland has been traditionally a neutral state, and it's really its relationship with Russia and Soviet Union prior to that, aside from going back to 1940 and the war that was fought between them, the relationship has worked quite well, with Finland being neutral and non-aligned. But the fact now is that it's kind of hard to be non-aligned in this kind of polarized and political environment that's been created by this war.
I'm going to follow up with those, with some questions that have to do with the military options before us. And so we have a question here that asks, should NATO impose a no-fly zone? Another asking, is there a third party that is not part of NATO that might commit troops or air assets? And then finally, to round this off, what security guarantees could the West offer that could stop the invasion? So what are the military possibilities on the table here?
Well, I think for one thing, I wouldn't suggest a no-fly zone. I don't think that would work in this kind of war. I think it would be something that Russia would resist very strongly if that happened. I think in terms of going back to the table and having discussions about what can be done to appease Russia would also be a mistake. I don't think you can reason with Vladimir Putin today. I think the days of discussion have gone, and there's no point in trying to sit down at a table with Vladimir Putin anymore, because the way it is, someone has to win and someone has to lose, and that is the way Putin would approach any discussion. It would be seen as the West taking fright and giving way. In terms of resorting to, more escalation and nuclear weapons, it's kind of unthinkable, but nevertheless, it's not impossible. We've often thought things are impossible for Vladimir Putin to do, and he's gone and done them. And therefore, you shouldn't simply, I think, dismiss the idea that this could end up with an escalated war or even Third World War. It could. And I think in terms of intervention, as I mentioned, I'm suggesting that China would be the obvious one. China would be the obvious one because China is neutral. China wants the war to end so it can revive its trade with these countries. Politically, China may be different from most countries of the West, but at the same time, it is powerful enough to have an impact. And it's a member of the UN Security Council and has been with different leaderships, of course, but right from the outset in 1945. So that's, I think, how this could develop if it comes to a question of some pulling Russian troops out and reaching an agreement. Of course, this is all supposition because I'm not going to read Vladimir Putin's mind on this and couldn't even try to. Sorry,
you've mentioned briefly this possibility of a nuclear war resulting from this conflict. Could you elaborate a little bit more, you think, on this possibility, and of the outcomes that you listed, what do you think is the most likely from this conflict?
I think the nuclear war would only occur if either the war spread into a NATO country like Poland or Baltic states, or NATO intervened directly in the war by sending a military force into Ukraine to defend Ukraine against Russia. That would be the cataclysmic moment when it could develop further. And I'm getting tired. The second question was?
Oh, sorry. And the second question was, you had listed a number of possibilities of how this all
yes.
would play out. And I
Which
was wondering,
most likely, yeah.
And this is again asking you to take out your crystal ball and gaze into it. But do any of those strike you as the more likely or more plausible than others?
Well, I think Putin intends to bring down the Ukrainian government. And I think he will try to do that by every means at his disposal and for as long as it takes. But the longer the war goes on, the more difficult the position for Russia from every angle, from military, economic, social effects, everything. So the longer Ukraine resists, then the more frustrated I think Vladimir Putin will get. But ultimately, one would imagine, given the size of his forces, that eventually he would prevail in this, but only in a way that you could regard as a kind of temporary victory. That you seem to have succeeded, you've got rid of the government, you've installed your own government, which is exactly what the Soviet Union did in Afghanistan. But it didn't make any difference because 90% of the population was opposed to it. And eventually the situation began to change. And that's what I think would happen. And if the war continues, that is, I think, the most likely outcome, that Russia would occupy Kiev, but it would be only something that worked for the time, that in the long term, it will not work for Putin. I think, I mean, someone who I've been watching Putin now for 20 odd years, it's the biggest mistake he's made in his political life. And I, for the life of me, cannot understand why he made it.
I'm going to switch now the focus domestically to Russia. And political scientists like to say that authoritarian leaders do not rule alone, that they depend upon a coalition of elites that surround him. So I want to ask you, what is happening in your view to that coalition of elites around Putin? What does that continued support look like? And so that's at one level. And then on another level, what do you make of Putin's public support? We've heard reports that Putin has tried to say very little about the war at home to ordinary Russians. We've heard the stories about Russian mothers surprised that their sons are fighting in Ukraine. And so I'm curious as to whether you see the possibility of the elite support that's propping him up crumbling, or the possibility of an uprising, a domestic uprising.
Yes, I mean, if the war goes badly, or if there's an economic collapse, I think there would be, at least the elite would address the situation and how bad it's getting. But I watched Putin's meeting with his Security Council before this war started, and I saw maybe a dozen terrified individuals, including the Minister of Defense, frightened to cross Putin, all looking very miserable, but none of them in a position to do anything about it. In the parliament, as you know, Putin's party completely dominated in the last election in 2021, controls about 75% of the seats and more like 85% if you look at the parties that actually supported Putin. And this is fairly solid support in the main legislative body of the country. So Putin is in very firm control. But like all dictators, you know, these things can change very dramatically if the economic situation starts to decline. In terms of what the population is getting on social media, on television, they're getting one particular line. The people who will see different perspectives are the ones who can tune into Western channels, people with knowledge of foreign languages, people who travel. They would all gradually develop a completely different picture of what is happening. But on the lower levels of society, average town, average village, somewhere deep in the Russian Federation, one can imagine that most people are watching what's happening and saying, get rid of these Nazis in Kiev and let's put a new government there. And they're not seeing what the rest of the world sees. But if you look at the vote in the United Nations a couple of days ago, I've never seen Russia this isolated before. And even countries that voted Russia's way in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea are now voting against. I mean, apart from Eritrea, who have we got? Cuba, Belarus, and Venezuela. I think that's about all, the ones who voted against the condemnation of Russia. So this is a sign, I think, that most of the world is prepared to resist this show of force. And eventually this Russian side is going to be completely isolated and either back down or resort to something completely desperate. And I think to some extent this is happening when you looked at that cluster bomb hit in Kharkiv yesterday, a weapon that's been outlawed internationally, already being used in Ukraine. This suggests that there's desperation on the Russian side, thanks to what is happening in Ukraine, the heroic resistance in Ukraine, and the fact that the international community is so against this invasion.
And when you look at the support that Putin has from his allies and so on in Belarus, what do you see happening as sanctions begin to bite there? And I'll also mention that I've seen reports of some Belarusian units joining to fight on the side of Ukraine. And I don't know what you make of that, but I was wondering what you can say about whether we're likely to see maybe a shift in Lukashenko's position or whether Lukashenko's own authority in Belarus might be undermined.
Well, I would say that we get a misleading picture of what's coming from Belarus because the majority of Belarusians are opposed to Lukashenko. And that's been quite clear since the election of August 2020. What has happened is Lukashenko has used his security forces to repress the demonstrations, the protesters. So you have more political prisoners in Belarus today than you had in the entire period of the Cold War. That's how severe the repression has been in Belarus. And those that are not in jail or in labor camps have fled abroad. There must be about 1 million Belarusians now living in different countries of the world who fled from Lukashenko's regime. So Lukashenko is lacking support within his own country, and he's been increasingly reliant on Vladimir Putin to keep him in power. Even leaders of social media, the whole television network of Belarus, left voluntarily after the mass protests, and their places were taken by broadcasters from Russia. So the entire media of Belarus is controlled by Russia. The foreign policy of Belarus is controlled by Russia, and Russia is trying to undermine the government of Belarus in different ways. And even the language between Lukashenko and Putin has changed dramatically. It used to be almost bluff, how are you doing, sort of gangster type greetings. Now Lukashenko is like a supplicant, almost treats Putin like a dear leader, someone who has to be followed, treats him with respect. And, I don't like Lukashenko, but this is pathetic to see him, him reduced in this kind of fashion. So this is where Belarus stands. So Russia may well think that Belarus is fairly secure as long as Lukashenko is managed to be in power as this kind of puppet leader. Same things happened, by the way, in Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan, there were massive protests last year against what was seen as a sort of Nazarbayev legacy continuing in Kazakhstan. And Russia immediately moved in and repressed that as well. So Russia has been working in these countries all around its neighborhood. And, of course, been in Moldova now for almost 30 years as well, in Transnistria, with the breakaway state there and in the breakaway regions of Georgia. So this has been happening for some time, but it's never reached this kind of level of intensity.
We have another question that's come in, and that is, there have been many comparisons made between Putin now and Hitler in Germany in the 1930s. So if Putin is successful in occupying Ukraine, is he likely to continue pressing on? So would he risk taking the smaller adjacent countries? Or can anyone even really predict his strategy now?
Well, that last statement was absolutely correct. Nobody can predict his strategy now. But the likelihood is, yes, that he would continue and pursue this. If he's successful in Ukraine, he would be quite likely to try in other states as well, because there's no going back this time. I think that the comparison with Hitler is somewhat far-fetched, in that with Hitler, there's a deep anti-Semitic sentiment there, the eradication of from the face of Europe. There's not that sentiment with Putin. In fact, on the opposite, he thinks Ukrainians belong to Russia and that they're part of Russia. So he wants to bring in people. But in terms of where he will go from there, I think he would be tempted to go further if he was successful. But having said that, I mean, it's far-fetched because this kind of situation will not bring success.
Okay. I have another question. It's a long one, so stick with me on this question.
I need a pen.
To what extent do you see Putin as motivated by the works of Alexander Dugin, especially Foundations of Geopolitics? And related to this, do you agree with Fiona Hill that this is part of a broader conflict? I've personally termed this the Battle of Ukraine as a broader hybrid war for the subjugation of Europe, a battle of sanctions versus energy cuts whose outcome seems certain for Europe. And I'll tack on one last bit here, and that if I can offer another follow-up, if you agree with the Dugin influence, do you see the Nord Stream pipelines as a way to exercise soft power against or with Germany and bring them on as a partner in a Russian subjugated Europe with which Russia can challenge China? So this is bringing in the energy dimension and broader geopolitics.
Yeah, that's very broad. And I obviously in his earlier presidency, Putin was influenced by Alexander Dugin, but I think of late that influence has been exaggerated. And I think it's less now than it was in the past. I agree with Fiona on some points that she's made, and that Putin does see this broader conflict and that he's prepared to do what it takes to get his way and reverse the situation that occurred at the end of the Cold War, when he sees Russia as being pushed back and back and back. And now you have to reassert Russia as a great power in the world. But the subjugation of Europe, I think, is probably going a bit too far. And, you know, at the moment, as I mentioned, you know, this is not an economy that can sustain a war on such a scale. And Putin's already had problems conquering a state that's 3 times smaller, and is not, in fact, made an attack on any part of Russia, by the way. This is an interesting aspect that I was thinking about today. There have been no Ukrainian attacks. Not even a missile has been launched at Russia from any direction. But you've had this constant onslaught of Russian forces into Ukraine, but being repelled. And you look all along these roads, streams of blown up tanks, everybody in Kiev and Kiev in particular, they're preparing Molotov cocktails for when this convoy arrives. This is not a state that's going to conquer Europe or even be a rival for China, let alone the United States. The one thing Russia's got that make it a power is nuclear weapons. And there is a danger that if Russia is forced back too much with someone like Putin at the helm, then he might be tempted to use them. But one would hope that eventually common sense prevails and that the change of regime comes from within Russia itself and not from something imposed from the outside. So I think Dugin's influence is exaggerated, but I do think that Putin regards himself as carrying the destiny of Russia in his hands, that he is going to be the arbiter of Russia's return as a great power. And I was thinking back to his election manifesto in 2000 that I started my class with today, he's talking about, restoration of the patrimonial state, the great state of Russia, and how he's going to bring this about when he's president. Well, to some extent, Russia is asserting itself in the world and was doing reasonably well, I would have said, until this current move. As for the pipeline, the pipeline is a big deal to Russia. And also the partnership of Germany was very important to Russia. And as we've seen, the Gazprom board was made up partly of German business people as well as Russians. And there's been strong economic links between the two. But now Germany's clearly taken a different line altogether. So it's quite plain that Germany is not going to be part of this. And so I think it's an illusion to think that the world is going to go back to normal if and when this ends.
David, there's another dimension of this war. It's not just a war of guns and boots, but in many senses also a propaganda war. And I think we could argue that war has been going on since 2014. And can you comment on the impact that has had on not only on Ukraine but on the West more generally? How is the propaganda war going for Putin?
Well, it's going badly now. I'm not sure that was always the case, but in the past it was considerably more subtle in the way it was framed, and especially the way social networks were used by Russia for various purposes all over the world. And I think at one time Russia was clearly ahead in that regard. That not that the image of Putin necessarily was better, but that the image of Ukraine was portrayed in a very narrow manner. And this was, I think, generally from an ignorance of the breakdown of Ukrainian society and a focus on what is wrong with Ukraine, focus on corruption, for example, on far-right forces, people who attack gypsy camps and things like that, on, let's say, neo-Nazi collaborators back from the Second World War, having demonstrations in the center of Kiev. But you can take all these factors, which are not laudatory in any way whatsoever, and I've been among those who criticize them, and look at Russia and you see exactly the same thing replicated, but even greater extent. All these things are happening, and we shouldn't really act here like saints because they're happening in North America too. You're seeing the same kind of framework. And I was thinking to myself, and I know others have thought this same way, Joe Biden is president of the United States. What would have happened in this war if Donald Trump had been president of the United States? How would have been the reaction then? It would have been total chaos in terms of a unified Western response to this war. And this could happen again in 2 years' time. This is why I think the West really has to get its act together and come up with a more permanent strategy for dealing with Russia and dealing with this kind of social network operation. And it's hard to know exactly where to begin because it's already gone so far. But we certainly can't be negligent. We certainly can't be casual. And I think it's something that can't be decided by any individual country. It's got to be decided by all countries, either through the United Nations or through something else. But the United Nations at least is there. That was established to keep world order, keep world peace. It hasn't worked very well of late. So maybe to start thinking about reframing the Security Council, for example, rotating the Security Council so that we don't have 5 permanent members. We have rotating membership just like you do with the General Assembly chairship. That, to me, would be a far fairer way to proceed, and it would make it into a much more impartial body. Because you could argue that United States, Russia, China, great powers, have been the cause of most of the wars that have happened since 1945, one way or another. So why should they be the arbiters of what happens in the world? So I'm thinking along these sort of terms, right, when we're looking at how this war, what could happen in the aftermath of this war.
And in terms of what else the West could have done differently, and you've talked about, you've mentioned that you thought that if Trump were president in the U.S., we would have seen a much more chaotic unfolding of this. Do you think that the U.S. And Western countries more generally bear any of the responsibility for the invasion of Ukraine? Is there anything you can point to say, well, if they had done this?
Well, I mean, they could, of course, said Ukraine will never become a member of NATO. But that was really left to NATO itself to come up with that comment, that NATO membership cannot be decided by a country that's not a member of NATO.
Did we miss a moment in our reaction to the invasion of Crimea?
Oh, Crimea. Well, I think it came as a surprise to just about everybody when that happened, and that it took place so smoothly. But also, I think the fact that to Vladimir Putin, what was happening in Kiev was so unacceptable to him as the president of Russia. And the Maidan uprising divided Ukraine as well, to be fair. I saw a poll at the time which suggested 50% in favor and 48% against in terms of this uprising. So it did divide Ukraine. And Putin used this as an opportunity, I think, to satisfy an old score and make himself popular at the same time. There have also been times during his long presidency when he's used wars as a kind of diversion. He did it right at the beginning of his presidency when he reinvaded Chechnya. But if you remember, before he invaded Chechnya, well, you might not remember, Laurie, but before he invaded Chechnya, there were bomb attacks in different cities across Russian Federation, and FSB was found to have implications in the bomb attacks in several of these cities. In other words, the bombs were planted in order to create a pretext for going back into Chechnya. Then you have the situation in Georgia in 2008, which is blamed on Saakashvili and Saakashvili's foolishness in trying to ensure that these breakaway regions should be brought under central control by the Tbilisi government. And then again, in Crimea, using the claim that neo-Nazis are taking over Kiev, therefore we're going to take Crimea, we're going to satisfy their demands, and then move into the Donbas, and all of Ukraine is going to immediately, Eastern Ukraine anyway, is going to immediately acclaim as liberators, which never happened. And today, I honestly think that Putin expected in Eastern Ukraine to get a better reception than Russian troops got. And I also am very surprised that he sent in so many raw recruits, because that suggests he completely underestimated the sort of opposition that he's been getting. And, you know, it's a fact that Russia has focused emphasis on special forces rather than the regular army, which is based on national service of 2 years. So they are necessarily raw recruits that are being put into the initial operation.
That's interesting. We have just time for, I would say, maybe one or two more questions. I'm going to take us back to the question of religion, and you've highlighted the role of national identity and Putin's vision for a greater Russia. And I understand, this question is, I understand that Putin is close and collaborates with the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. Knowing how strong the Russian people are attached to the church, would condemnation by the church have an impact on Putin? And would this cause him to lose the support of his citizens, and would it lead to internal unrest and opposition to this war?
Well, I'm inclined to answer yes, it would definitely have an impact. But the last statement that you just made, would it lead to unrest and resistance? It may not go that far. The church has been closely tied to the leadership for some time, but particularly under Putin. And it's already been some leading figures in the Russian church have made statements already condemning a war in Ukraine, saying we don't know why we need to be at war with Ukraine. They're our brothers. This is not the way to go. It wouldn't necessarily change Putin's mind on any topic, because practically there's not a lot the church can do to restrain him without having any kind of political power. The church has survived because it basically has followed what the government is doing and has allowed the government to develop in the way it has. I think the church was very upset by the nationalization of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in 2018. Having said that, of all the topics that we've been discussing today, this is the one I feel least equipped to answer adequately. And we've got people like Heather Coleman and Frank Sisson in the audience here, I think could do a better job than me on that particular question. So maybe I should pass on to the next one.
Well, I'll take us to our last question and I'll wrap up with this. And can you, from your point of view, tell us what to expect in the days ahead? What are some of the signals to watch for in the evolution or direction of this conflict? And then finally, a lot of people are asking, what can ordinary citizens everywhere do? What can they do to support Ukraine and help to bring about an end to this war?
Yeah, well, there are two very big questions. I think in terms of where the war is going to go, we are seeing an attack on the two major cities right now. If these cities fall, then the war could theoretically end there. That is, if the government of Ukraine is either detained or eliminated or gives up, which I think is increasingly unlikely because they've shown no inclination to do that. But then the war could come to an end. If they resist, then I think the war might escalate with indiscriminate bombing rather than a ground war that's predominated so far, but without achieving anything substantial in terms of gains. In terms of what the average person can do to help Ukraine, I think right now the prime need of Ukraine is to help people who've tried to leave. And certainly the only opportunity to leave is through a gateway to Poland. Belarus is effectively now cut off as well, so they cannot go north. They can only go west through Poland. And so far, Poland has been very open to taking in refugees. But at some point, it'll reach a situation when the sheer scale of people trying to leave Ukraine will be too much for Poland alone to deal with. And then you will need a more international effort, I think. If people want to fight, then you can volunteer I believe that the requirement is that you're not a member of the armed forces of your country, because then you will be representing your country. But if you're not a member of the armed forces and you want to go and help Ukraine by fighting, and you have some equipment, you could do that as well. But I think for most people, the main way to help will be through helping the people in need. And that is getting increasingly worse every day as people are running out of food and water, running out of accommodation that's reliable. The electricity is going to be cut off in several places. Incidentally, Ukrainians are currently defending their huge nuclear power station in Enerhodar region of Zaporizhia, biggest nuclear power station in Europe, supplies about 30% of Ukraine's electricity needs. If Russia takes that power station or takes the one in Mykolaiv, which is also very close to Russian forces, Ukrainians could be without electric power, and all that comes with it. This is the kind of thing that it will be very difficult to deal with, I think. And so this is going to be a sort of crisis of humanitarian size happening in Ukraine over the next days and weeks. And that I think is the biggest concern, as well as the way Russia has been, of course, bombing the cities.
Well, there are so many other questions that have come in, which regrettably we do not have time to answer today. But Professor David Marples, thank you for your insights.
Thank you very much, Laurie, and thanks for hosting, and thanks to the Birth Institute as well for hosting this event. I appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for coming too.
Well, this brings us to the end of today's Zoom presentation. I'd like to thank Dr. Marples very much for his richly informative talk and the very thoughtful and very generous responses to the questions, and for helping us to understand this complicated situation. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Thorlickson for masterfully moderating the Q&A. We had well over 100 questions submitted. We didn't get to all 100 questions, but I'd like to also thank our audience for attending and for engaging so enthusiastically. And just for everyone's information, we had over 600 registrants for this event. And I think at our peak, we had more than 450 people who were on the Zoom attending to the lecture and the Q&A. This topic is obviously very much on everyone's mind, and it's so crucial that we're well informed as we follow unfolding events and we try to figure out what the future is going to look like for Ukraine, for Russia, for the rest of Europe. So we'll sign off for now. If I can offer a wish for a swift and peaceful resolution to this conflict. And on behalf of everyone at the Worth Institute, thank you all for participating. Take care.